Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cristiana Spontoni, and I'm a partner in the Brussels office of Jones Day. On behalf of our firm and of the Bingham Center, it is my very pleasure to extend our warm welcome to you, particularly knowing that you've been called to come an hour earlier, and we really would like to thank you for your flexibility to accommodate this. We're absolutely fortunate to have I want to say, an extraordinary panel here with us. And again, on behalf of Bingham and Jones Day, I would really like to thank all of you to making time available today to be with us. So thank you, Mr. De Croo, thank you, Daniela, Laura, Hendrik, and Malcolm. Brexit has, I want to say, shaken Europe and beyond. And our firm is strongly committed, also through our Brexit task force, to help our clients navigate through the legal and regulatory uncertainties of this unprecedented development in the history of the EU. Many of us are here are members of the task force, including the partner in charge of our London office. So if you would like to find out anything about it, please come to us after the event. This event has been organized in the framework of our firm's partnership with the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. Jones Day is strongly committed to the development of the rule of law, and we have done many initiatives around the world to show our commitment. We're therefore very proud to be in a partnership with Bingham, and I would like Matt Trum, who is from the center, to spend a couple of words about the center and the exchange that the center is promoting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christiana. Thank you, everybody else, for coming today. As Christiana said, I don't want to take too long, really, so that we can hand over to our speakers. Very quickly, just want to say a few words about the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. We're based in London. We're part of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. The Bingham Center was founded in 2010 to honor the work of the Lord Bingham of Cornwall, a great judge and passionate advocate of the rule of law. The center is dedicated to the study, promotion, and enhancement of the rule of law worldwide. And we do this through various means, including applied research, conducting capacity building events on the rule of law. And we do this to help countries, international organizations, corporations, and legal bodies to build rule of law commitments, whilst also improving the skills and abilities of legal practitioners and governments around the world to secure access to justice for their populations. I'll be around, as I think most of you will be, after the event. So if you need any more information, any more leaflets or brochures about the Bingham Center itself, they're available outside as well. Without any further ado, Daniela, I think over to you.
Thank you, Jones Day, and thank you, Bingham. I'm pleased to be the moderator selected for this event, which promises an interesting debate, looking at the panel here, but also looking at where we stand in the Brexit saga, if I can call it like that. The debate of today is doing business in a post-Brexit Europe. What of the single market? Which, as you know, is the one thing that the Brits really wanted to maintain. The problem is that they had not probably reflected very well, as the single market is part of the four freedoms, including the freedom of movement, which was one of the reason for why they actually decided to leave the EU. So with this sort of crescendo in the drama, now we are at the moment where we're stuck on process. Prime Minister Theresa May insisted a free trade agreement be negotiated from the starting parallel with talks on the financial terms of the exit to the EU. The guidelines, as you know, have been adopted last weekend by the European Council, and these set actually a different path. Barnier reiterated the same today. The EU insists that progress be made on the terms of the Brexit financial settlement and on the rights of EU citizens living in the UK, as well as the future of the Irish border, before we actually start turning our head to hard bargaining on trade. Now, as we all know, the impact on trade and markets, not least on the financial markets, will be huge, as a future partnership agreement will be translated into specific provisions for the single market, the EU customs union, and the application of competition and EU state aid rules. Just today, I'm sure many of you know, JP Morgan confirmed it will move hundreds of banking jobs from the UK to the EU, and namely Dublin, Frankfurt, and Luxembourg. Just today, we at Euractiv carried a story on how regulatory uncertainty in the wake of Brexit could leave Britain's multi-billion-pound medical technology, the medical technology sector and industry out in the cold with separate regulatory system threatening export and jobs. So we are here to consider really what will be the impact under this uncertainty, because nothing is really set since no member states has ever left the EU. We're here to consider the alternative arrangement that could come up during the negotiation. And for that, I'm happy to present our speakers, Alexander De Croo, who doesn't need to be presented, but I'll do anyhow. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Development of Belgium, Minister of Development Cooperation, Digital Agenda, Post and Telecom in the Belgian Federal Government. You have quite a number of tasks. From 2012 to 2014, he was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Pensions. Before that, he was party chairman of Open VLD, the Flemish Liberal Democrats. And prior to that, you were an entrepreneur, and especially in the field of intellectual property rights. Malcolm Harbour doesn't need, for the seasoned EU affairs reporters like I am, and public affairs officers experts in the panel, doesn't need much presentation. He was elected as Conservative MEP in 1999 and re-elected in 2004, 2009. From 2009 to 2014, he served as chairman of the European Parliament IMCO committee, precisely dealing with the internal market. He was a key player in shaping policy and legislation for the single market. He did not seek re-elections, unfortunately. I was sad you didn't do it. And in July 2014, sorry? Yeah, I retired, but you know, retirement doesn't count anymore in these days. And in July 2014, he was appointed to the Council of Birmingham University. He's also senior advisor on the single market for the European Policy Center and EU policy consultant at Cabinet DN. Laura Atto, she is president and chief executive officer of the Bank of New York Mellon's European Bank. Prior to being named to this position in 2014, she serves as CEO of investment services in the same bank. Prior to joining that bank, Laura was deputy chief operating officer and head of operation and technology at Baring Asset Management in London. She has an extensive experience in various financial places, not least, not just London, but obviously Frankfurt as well. Henry Bourgeois, who is head of European affairs at GE, and his most recent prior position at GE included General Counsel for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and Senior European Competition Council. Prior to joining GE, Hendrik was an attorney in the same house, Jones Day. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each one of you to give initial comments on the topic of the debate, and we'll try to make it as interactive. I see a huge room, a full room, so I will try to make it as interactive as possible from the start, just because we know that Alexander De Croo has to leave us at 4 o'clock. Okay. Alexander, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize because I'm the reason that everything was pushed forward for 1 hour. So apologies for that. We'll try to make it a good discussion. I think one thing that strikes me is that in this negotiation between the United Kingdom and Europe, there's a few imbalances. I think one imbalance is the level of importance that the discussion of the Brexit has for both parties. For the Brits, this is obviously the most important topic. This is the only topic they still have left in discussion with the European Union. I think from the Union's perspective, this is definitely not the most important topic. I mean, this is one of the topics that we should discuss, but in the level of importance, there are other topics which will be way more important than this Brexit discussion, and that will be using way more bandwidth of European politics. At least that should be the goal, and this is what a country like Belgium will be pushing for. From our perspective, let's say in my domain, the completion of the digital single market is much more important than the breakup discussions with the Brits, and I think there's a few other topics like that. That's on a political level. I think there's another gigantic imbalance on the more economic trade level, is that the impact of the discussion on the British economy is, from a trade flows perspective, much more important than it is for the European economy. Trading with the Brits is a part of our trade, but for the Brits, trading with Europe is a much larger part of that. And maybe a third element is that, well, obviously you cannot have it both. I hear Theresa May saying we will be the most globalized economy, we will become the pinnacle of trade in the world. Okay, I hear that, but that's hard to claim that when you say that you basically want to let go frictionless trade with the biggest trading bloc in the world, which is the European Union. And I do not believe that you would say, well, we were one single market, we will go to something else which will actually be better than the single market. That I really do not see what it could be, at least not if you don't respect the balance, which means, yes, you can get access to the single market and the 4 freedoms that are associated with it, but then also you have movement of people, budgetary contributions, and so on. So it is a very imbalanced negotiation to me, with a time frame which is not an easy one. It's a 2-year time frame. My short experience in politics is always that if you need to negotiate with a deadline, it makes things much harder, and the deadline is in the advantage of the European Union. Now, to conclude, I do not think that any of the countries is looking to punish the Brits, is looking to make this something which would be an unbalanced thing. But maybe the level of expectations will also be very different.
Thank you. It's very interesting. What you're saying, it seems that echoes a bit what President Juncker said when he went out of the dinner, yes, with Mrs. May.
Juncker is echoing me, obviously, yes.
Probably echoing the 27 other countries trying to make sense out of it. But Malcolm, basically what Alexander De Croo is saying is that we have a disconnect between what the Brits are thinking and perceiving and what the Europeans We have always been in a disconnect, but here the disconnect is so huge that it seems we are from different galaxies indeed. What is your perception?
Well, I think you have to disconnect the sort of rhetoric from the practicalities, because I mean the British still have a reputation for pragmatism, which I suspect will be unveiled when we start some serious discussion. But perhaps just to go back a couple of paces. I mean, first of all, I mean, I'm not here to support the position of the government because I'm not a member of the government, and I was a member of the Conservative member of the European Parliament who argued very strongly that we should stay in. Unfortunately, the British electorate didn't accept that, and I have to live with the realities of that. But I mean, I just want to focus a bit on the topic of the discussion around the single market, because I came into European politics as a passionate advocate of the single market. I mean, that's what drew me into European politics, having worked in manufacturing industry for a long time. And so, I mean, in terms of the broader messages going forward, I mean, we can talk very specifically around the issues for the UK, but I think for Europe overall, the first and most important message, it seems to me, is that the 27 countries continue to press forward in making the single market work better, because there is no question, in my view, and having been there, that the UK was one of the strongest political advocates of making the single market work better. And so Europe has lost that strong advocacy. And I just want to give you a particular example, because I think that the market for goods is pretty well established. We could make it work better. And indeed, this Commission, Mrs. Bieńkowska, has introduced measures to do that. I think the issue that the European Union has to move forward on is the whole market for services. Now, that's been relatively recent. I was the leader of the centre-right group in the European Parliament that eventually managed to broker a compromise of getting the Services Directive through in 2006. And Europe was very divided about that. I got to know Jose Manuel Barroso very well over that period. But just to remind you that the French at the beginning in 2004 were absolutely against the Services Directive, and Mr. Chirac went to President Barroso and said, "I demand that you withdraw this proposal." So, you know, things are not straightforward, and we still have a lot of work to do. So I think I would say politically here in this city that the challenge for everyone is to make sure that without Britain around the table, a strong advocate for the digital single market and moving the services market forward, because the services market is still not working as it should do according to the existing rules. And it will be very important to do that. Now, as far as Britain's position is concerned, I mean, the paradox in all that and what I've said to you is that services at the moment is being almost entirely neglected by the British negotiators, apart from financial services. Because there are many members of Parliament, particularly on the Brexit side, who claim there was never a single market for services anyway, which was rewriting the truth in so many ways. So how are we going to move forward on this? Well, there's been a clear political decision made, and I don't think that's going to be overturned, that the key thing that the government feels its interpretation of the referendum result is that we have to get control of immigration, and that on that logic, Mrs. May said, well, we can't possibly stay in the single market as a wholly integrated single market on a Norwegian model. So it is going to have to be some sort of complex and difficult negotiation, because the government is proposing, and by the way, those of you that haven't read the paper, it's an important one to read, legislating for the UK's withdrawal. This is from the British perspective, but we're told that all of the acquis, essentially, that where we've developed legislation with our European partners is going to be essentially written into the UK statute book with some adjustments as necessary. And it is absolutely inevitable we're going to need a transitional period to go through all of that. I think there are about 20,000 pieces of legislation, and decide how we want to keep up engagement. And I know that the European Commission is saying, well, there isn't going to be any cherry picking. I mean, I think that as a phrase is clearly going to be open to interpretation. because there are clearly going to be areas where it is going to be in the interests of every participant in the British economy to continue to be engaged and to have equivalence in legislation, and maybe also support things like the Food Standards Agency, the Chemicals Agency, data protection, communications, BEREC. I mean, I could go on, but where the UK is already playing an integral part. And I think part of the final agreement is going to have to be some sort of terms of engagement where if the UK decides it wants to be engaged with those, we can set up some sort of conciliation process, because the Prime Minister has made it clear that Britain is accepting the fact that it will have to accept legislation in which it has no direct say in future. The Prime Minister said that. It's a pity that she didn't say that during the campaign for Brexit. But the fact remains is that is the position that Britain now finds itself in. And those of us who were involved in influencing the process are now going to have to take a back seat, but at least I think we can look for some terms of engagement in that transitional period. And so after we've sorted out the finances, after we've sorted out citizens' rights, we need to get down to what those terms of engagement are going to be. And it is quite clear in the Council conclusions and in the Barnier paper this morning that there is going to be provision to negotiate on what the framework of the transitional arrangement is going to be. And those will form the basis also of the future trade agreement. And I wasn't surprised if the newspaper reports are true that Mr. Juncker took the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with him to Downing Street just to remind the Prime Minister about the amount of work that's going to be involved. And talking about sucking the life out of politics, I mean, the problem that the British have, it is absolutely sucking the life completely out of British politics at the moment.
At least they're focused on that. We might not be focused completely on that, but I want to pick up on one point you said, Malcolm, regarding the services, because financial services, you say, it's neglecting all the other services except the financial services. Yeah. And here, maybe Laura has a view on how do you think that divorce is going to affect precisely that sector?
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. So, as Daniela explained, I'm the CEO of BNY Mellon's European Bank, and I just want to explain a little bit about the bank to give you context. So this is a bank whose parent is based in the US and whose regional headquarters is based in London. And we're a significant bank, but you can see we've got a leg in 3 different places, so it's quite interesting for us. We are not a retail bank. We provide services to institutional investors. And we have an extensive footprint throughout Europe. So we have branches in 7 locations, we have subsidiary, we have rep offices. So we're a pretty extensive European bank in lots of locations. What we are very conscious of needing, and I speak for the European Bank, but also for our company, is that we really are focused on the need for financial stability throughout this period, on the need to avoid disruption for citizens throughout Europe during this period, and the need for legal and contractual certainty. So we view those as really kind of the points that formulate how we think about the rest of the activities that we'll need to be thinking of as we progress our own plans. We are very client-led in our preparedness. So our sole mission really is to be able to have our services to clients continue without disruption against the background I just gave. And equally, our clients need to be able to continue to provide services to their own clients without disruption. So we're very much client-led. And so on that basis, we are preparing for the worst, which is, we would say, a hard Brexit. But I think you could almost say the hard Brexit's happened because we're in the discussions we're in. But we're making our plans around the worst, but of course, hoping to not have the worst outcome. In our own case, we're I think, in a unique position because we have this European bank. Our company also has a bank in London, so we have banks, we have licenses, we have people on the ground. We're in a good place, but I think for banks that are maybe not in as good a position as us, they've got quite a lot of work that they're doing right now to probably lead from the same point as we do, looking after their clients' interests. To the point of stability, a couple of risks that we see there and areas that we think it's important to pay attention to. One is fragmentation. I think right now it feels like there's a lot of EU 27 togetherness. I hope that holds. Malcolm mentioned cherry picking. I mean, maybe there will be some unique situations that arise as the negotiations continue, but in general, when I think about my own firm and some of the services, most of the services that we need to provide clients we already have here in Europe, but there are some that are contracted with entities with our bank, which is based in London. Some of those services will likely have to come here. It's not comfortable for me to have to be kind of discussing and debating with my colleagues in London which country, which branch of my bank they want to move those services to, because different locations are offering different things. I'd like us to keep very focused on our clients and maintaining continuity of service. So I think fragmentation's something, and the risks it can lead to are something we need to watch out for. And again, in context of the points I've made and following on to Malcolm's comments, we see a transition period or a bridging period, or it's defined differently. I know it's viewed differently, but we see that as really as quite essential. So I guess the last, I'd make two more points. One is we see capital markets union as more important than ever now, that the EU 27, maybe with Britain's continuing, the UK's continuing participation, really be seeking funding sources which are not wholly reliant on banks. And we, I think, are all focused on growth. So we're very focused, for example, on digitization, optimization, and growth. And I think that's true throughout the region. So making sure that the growth can be fueled during this time of great change, I think is important. And I guess the final thing I would say is we have a way of talking about this topic a bit internally, which is we're in a period right now which is very potentially volatile, uncertain, complex, and maybe ambiguous at times. And the people who are going to be most successful and thrive are the ones who can be resilient and have a positive attitude throughout all of this. And I think we're in for some real challenge on that front, but that's how we're trying to think about it.
Thank you, Laura, but you're still preparing for the worst. And
we are.
I wonder what worst would mean, and maybe I'm going to ask all of you, and start thinking maybe what would be the worst scenario, what would be the best scenario. Hendrik, you are in a totally different field, and I'm sure you're already starting to think on what are the scenarios, but also what is the best way for GE to adapt quickly to a hard Brexit, for example. So,
sure. No, but I think I agree with Laura's point. I think Brexit is creating a lot of attention-grabbing headlines in the media, and I think it's the task of business leaders and their representatives. So I was saying, I don't know if people heard me in the back, but what I was saying is that it's creating a lot of attention-grabbing headlines, and I think it's the task of business leaders and of their representatives to stay calm, carry on, engage in contingency planning, and adapt their business conduct to unforeseen events, basically. So from our perspective, this is a potentially serious event. Simply because the company that I work for, GE, has a very important economic footprint in the United Kingdom. But we have very integrated supply chains with the rest of the European Union, and we have a lot of customers in the European Union that are being served from the United Kingdom. Approximately 45% of products that leave the United Kingdom from our British factories end up in the European Union. and we purchase approximately 60% of supplies, components from the European Union for our factories in the United Kingdom. And so as a result, this is undoubtedly going to create disturbance, disruption, and it is creating uncertainty. So what we would like, obviously, is to have a transitional agreement, an arrangement that is as long and as deep as possible, because it will give us more time to work on this contingency planning. And my hope is that the announcement and hopefully the result of the UK elections will provide this government, UK government, some type of political stability and protection to actually engage in a longer transitional agreement that was originally anticipated, simply because, hopefully with a larger political majority, the current government will not have to suffer being criticized for trying to obtain such a longer transitional arrangement. Because obviously it will come with a cost. It will come with, the need for, I believe, the UK to continue participating in the EU budget. It will come with the need for the UK to continue to be under the jurisdiction of the European courts. And so with a new, hopefully strong majority, that would enable, hopefully, the UK government to have a longer transitional period as an objective, so which would be good, obviously. So that's number one. Number two, I think what we would ask the UK government is, to the extent there is a need for introduction of regulatory flexibility, and that's a very important point, because as Malcolm pointed out, if we think about single market, where there is absolutely a huge amount of progress to be made in the services field, and barriers to trade and services is very much related to regulation, because that's the way you can impede trade and services, by regulating. And so to the extent one wants to reduce barriers to trade and services, one has to introduce regulatory flexibility internally in the UK. But if you introduce regulatory flexibility, you run the risk of losing equivalence. And so that's also something that we're concerned about, because obviously the UK will have to compensate for some loss of competitiveness, which, by the way, for companies might be good news, because it could deregulate, it could lower corporate taxes to compensate. But of course, if the UK government try to do this, then it creates an issue in terms of equivalence, and how is the UK going forward going to trade on fair terms with the rest of the European Union? And so that's a question that we're asking ourselves. And then last but not least, which we haven't broached yet, is really access to talent, which is of critical importance for companies that operate in the UK, whether they're British owned or not. If companies cannot retain talent and expertise based on substance, but it has to choose based on nationality, that would be indeed terrible news, I think. So it is very important to think about these issues going forward. But at the same time, I also think, and I want to pick up, maybe try to be a little bit controversial, I agree there's an imbalance. I agree that the UK has probably more to lose in this situation than the EU. But I think it's very dangerous for the EU to be complacent about this event. I think this is a serious blow to the European project that has reduced the size of the single market significantly. And I think that on the short term, it is of utmost importance if the EU, leaving aside the UK, but the EU wants to preserve some type of leadership in open markets, wants to preserve its attractiveness for investments. It cannot take this event lightly. It must take this with serious concern, and perhaps that's what the minister was alluding to. It should also use this as an opportunity to make progress on these everlasting construction sites that we've been working on for the last 10 to 15 years, with the digital single market, the energy union, the capital markets union. And if we haven't been able to make progress significant progress, sufficiently significant progress, in my personal opinion, with the Brits. Imagine what kind of progress we could make without the Brits. I question that. And so, maybe this will be, as people say, the European Union works well in times of crisis, when it absolutely has to work together. And my wish is that we may have reached the situation where we absolutely, in the European Union, need to make significant progress.
Alexander, I want to come back to you before opening the floor, because I'm conscious of time. Do you see that the EU, you are well placed to understand where we stand when it comes to finish those construction sites? Do you see that this wake-up call has been taken in an emergency, in an urgency mood, and we are progressing? Because from a journalistic point of view, I see a lot of goodwill, hard talk, but not really moving in the right direction. Maybe because we're still digesting the Brexit, because it took a long time to trigger Article 50, I must admit. So maybe because we're still digesting Brexit.
I think it is, at least on the short term, it's been a wake-up call, because there was people saying, well, this is a slippery slope. The anti-European voice will win the Dutch elections, which did not happen. Most of the parties winning the Dutch elections were actually very pro-Europe. And I have no crystal ball for France, but at least you have one of the two candidates who's very pro-European, who wants to change certain things in Europe. But what you see is that this is, I guess, the only positive element about the Brexit, is that voices are being raised throughout Europe of people who are very pro-European and who come with a much clearer, much more compelling story of what Europe should be and of what the value of Europe is. And I think that there has been complacency in the European Union over the last decades, where people would consider it's there, it's not perfect, but it's always going to be there, and everyone likes it, right? And that is obviously not the case. So I see a lot of optimism on that on that domain. I think that certain discussions will be less interesting without the British. We obviously like to have the British at the table when we are discussing efficient government, when we are discussing free trade, when we are discussing optimism towards technology, and so on. So that, I think, is a loss when they are not at the table. In other domains, I think it might be a bit easier without the British at the table, when we're talking about common military policy, about external action service, and so on. Often the British were the ones making the discussion harder. So I think in the end, it will be approximately the same. On all the main construction sites that need to happen. Thinking that at one point the European project will not be a construction site, I think is wrong. I think it will always be a construction site. Yeah. Because this is the essence of our history, like Brussels, maybe, yes. Well, let's hope the traffic moves better than Brussels. But it will always be something under construction. But yes, indeed, there is a few key elements which are really, really important to get things going. Now, we will only succeed in that, for me, in one crucial element, and that is that when national politicians come to Brussels, that they tell the same story at the cameras in Brussels as they tell at the cameras in their home capitals. Yeah. And that story has been very different. I mean, most European politicians come here, and the first thing they say in front of the European cameras is, I'm here to defend my national interests. Now, as long as Europe is dominated by that type of discussion, things are not going to work. That is the definition of what you could call a confederation. Confederation is we come at one place to discuss our problems. Now, if Europe is reduced to a problem-solving mechanism, then we are not exploiting the full potential. So, and I think that has been changing over the last months. The importance of the European debate and linking it back to the national debate, I think there's more transparency there. So I'm rather optimistic on that domain. Still, and here I talk from a personal perspective as a politician. I mean, as a politician, and it's the same in business, you get motivated by building something. And a discussion about building something is something motivating. A discussion about deconstructing something is not very motivating. And so I fear that in the next 2 years, these are going to be dreadful discussions about things that actually we do not like to discuss, and we will have to drag ourselves through that. Maybe that's an opportunity to have a second track with more optimistic things and more building things, and it could be something where people funnel their energy into.
Yeah. Precisely on that, I hear from all of you to have a transitional agreement as long as possible when it comes to sorry, am I doing the wrong thing here? Sorry. Transitional agreement as long as possible. Flexibility, regulatory flexibility when it comes. And I hear positive discourse to set up the negotiation on the right foot, basically. Mm-hmm. This is what you're saying, so that we don't pollute the moving forward fast enough, since we only have 2 years. Now, when...
I think that 2 years will not be sufficient. I'm
right.
quite sure that it will not be done in 2 years. But we can extend it.
So you can extend it, but if you have the unanimity of everyone, and there it's a question mark when it comes to countries like Poland, Hungary, sensitivities are not. This is a question for all of you, basically.
What do you mean about the transitional? Well, I mean, I think that it's quite clear that the best we can achieve within the current 2-year timetable is to put the framework in place, and plus deal with some of the issues like citizens' rights and the money. I mean, if it were me, I mean, I would be going into the first meeting. I mean, after the election, on the assumption that Mrs. May stays as Prime Minister, which I think is quite likely for the next 5 years, then I think the inhibitions that may have been felt previously about seeking an extension to the 2 years will have gone. Because actually there would have been problems doing that, because it would have taken the last government into an election period. So that's just worth bearing in mind. But the fact remains is that the detailed transitional period implied by the whole transfer of the European acquis into British law and sorting that out for the longer term is always going to be a project of several years on top of that. And I think that we need some sympathy, and I think that that's a very pragmatic approach to do that over an extended period. And part of that, I think, then gives the European Union and the Commission the opportunity in deciding what those structures are also to look at some of the elements that might not be working particularly well anyway. I mean, this Commission has been starting some proper work on refit, so-called, and looking at some of the complexities of the European acquis. It's quite clear that there are elements of single market rules that absolutely don't work consistently at the moment, and that many smaller member states are simply ill-equipped to enforce them anyway. And the European legislative process is extremely weak when it comes to actually getting analytical data from member states about the cost of applying European legislation. I mean, I did a lot of work on better regulation, so-called, when I was here. And if you go and talk to the Commission, I mean, it's absolutely clear that in many cases they're working without the data. And the Council of the European Union is by far the biggest and most unreformed set of institutions in Europe. It doesn't work particularly well. It doesn't have a proper impact assessment. It's an extremely intransparent body. And that's the reason why national parliaments feel, and citizens feel, so disconnected from the process. Because actually a lot of it is very technical, and when it gets into national parliaments there's not a lot of political traction that members of parliament can bite into, because they're not engaged with the process. And so all of these things, I think, are part of the lessons that could be learned, and I think people like me can contribute to that discussion in a constructive way, and as part of the fact that we could use that transitional period both to get a sensible result for the UK, hopefully, in terms of certainly keeping the single market for goods working well, but it could also be, I think, give benefits for Europe as well if we did it sensibly.
How long this transitional period?
Well, I think it has to be at least 5 years.
5 years. Is that enough?
5 years, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking, if I think about financial services, I just think quite practically. If there are 100,000 jobs in financial services in the City of London, maybe, and 30% of them need to relocate, if you want to be prepared to fill 30,000 roles in a few locations in Europe in a period of, let's say, 18 months, it's just not practical. So I think companies will want to be prepared, but they're going to want to withhold decisions that require big investment until kind of as late in the process as they can. And so that's what I think, kind of being prepared for the worst, but, you know, hoping things are better than the worst and not pulling the trigger too early can kind of mean. So if I think about that scale of infrastructure build out in that period of time, I don't think it's practical. Now, maybe as the negotiations progress, regulators can get comfortable with kind of working together and leaving some things in the UK, in London specifically, that could make a lot of sense. It's the financial center of Europe. I don't think anyone would really argue with that. That's not to say there's not room for other locations like Paris, Frankfurt, maybe other places to have their share of it. But in terms of sort of the big center of activity, that's a fairly significant undertaking, I think. So we think about it in quite a practical way, and it may be that along the negotiation path, what you actually need to do, it gets revised in a favorable way. So it's that sort of uncertainty that we feel requires transition period, bridging period. I know they mean different things to each party, but so it's really a practical matter as much as anything for us.
Andrew.
So as an observer, I think what we haven't talked about is the cliff edge scenario. Sure, you know, as long as possible, this is as I'm concerned, and we'll take whatever we can get, would be my view. But we need to be prepared also for the worst, right? And so there is a scenario where, you know, the negotiation starts and, you know, the European Union says we're going to talk about the withdrawal agreement and the bill. And the UK says, no, we're not. We're going to talk about both things, and people disagree, and both sides disagrees, and there's progress, and you know, and nothing happens, right? And what then? And then presumably, if there is no agreement, not even a transitional agreement within 2 years, then hopefully we could be in a WTO scenario. But that's not even for sure, because I think there could be arguments that if the UK would like to do, the UK that is a WTO member but doesn't have its own schedules of commitments, and if the UK simply does a cut and paste exercise and simply takes over the EU commitments and makes them into UK commitments, just change the headlines, I think it's not impossible that other WTO member states, perhaps not the European Union, but others would say, well, hang on, you're just taking over the 5% import tariff from the EU, but we think it should be only 2%. And because I agreed to the 5% because you were a member of the EU, and now you're no longer a member of the EU. And so you could potentially even end up in a scenario where, you know, WTO rules don't even apply anymore. So I think companies need to be prepared of these scenarios, and for us, it would be a substantive disruption of our supply chains. One example, if I may, is we have GE as an aircraft engines business, and we have a huge site in Cardiff that is dedicated to providing maintenance services to engines. So we take delivery from our airline customers of these huge engines, and we basically take them apart to service them, to repair them, to overhaul them. The way we do it, to a significant extent, is we send parts that are broken to outsourced suppliers on the continent who fix these parts and send them back. Or we purchase parts, components that need to be replaced from the continent. And so under a scenario where there would be, basically no single market, but no trade arrangement between the UK and the EU, our products, first of all, we'd have 4 additional customs declarations, which would be quite burdensome for all of those parts that we're buying and selling. And in addition, we fear the risk of increased tariffs. And so that would necessarily have an impact on the competitiveness of our operations in Cardiff vis-à-vis that of our competitors on mainland Europe or even outside the European Union. And all of these things, of course, are then counterbalanced with other factors such as exchange rates, for instance. So it's hard to say, will it be the end of the world? No, by no means, right? I'm sure that Brazilian companies will adapt, will find ways to be better than their competitors, and even in that situation try to find opportunities. But these are the types of scenarios that I think many businesses are thinking about and need to be prepared about.
So are you thinking to move that?
I'm not. Certainly not. But
I mean,
just
GE. I'm not you personally, but GE.
This is way too early, of course. But there are scenarios where the competitiveness of our British factories will be impacted.
Okay, now I'm going to open the floor to questions.
Thank you. I'm Matt Evans. I'm a partner at Jones Day in the London office. One of the key issues in the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom running up to the referendum was free movement of people, one of the 4 freedoms. In discussing the potential for a transitional agreement, I know that the UK government has said no deal is better than a bad deal. I'm not sure what that means, but in the context of a transitional agreement, and I'm particularly interested in Mr. de Cruz's view, do you think there might be an appetite within the EU 27, particularly in light of the fact that over 40% of the French electorate voted for anti-EU parties in the first round of the French election, and there's been more doubt expressed by member states on free movement and the impact of rapid immigration from one part of the EU to another? Do you think there might be an appetite for some sort of pause or accommodation on the free movement of people for a transitional period in between the sort of 2-year negotiation period coming away and some ultimate trade or other arrangement between the EU 27 and the United Kingdom?
I actually think that if you go for a transitional agreement, I think it should be limited in time, and it should be enforced. And if it means, okay, let's be transitional on access to the market, then it will also be subject to budgetary supervision by the Commission and judiciary supervision by the Court of Justice, and so on, which is, as someone has said, actually the things that have been rejected in the Brexit. So, from what I hear from the business side, my feeling is that the Brexit in itself is actually quite far away, because that transitional period could actually be quite long, and it could be beneficial to have it from a trade perspective. But there's a balance, there's a pendant to that. I cannot imagine that the 27 countries would say, well, in that transitional period, let's make some kind of watered down version for the United Kingdom. Today, I do not see that happen. Today, what came out of the discussions of this week are completely diametrically against that. So I wouldn't see that happen. Now, this is politics and it's the real world. So in the next 2 years, a lot of things can happen.
Not so much on free movement of people. In trying to find, you are based in the UK, and we have the feeling that when it comes to common sense, the UK has a difficulty in, how can I say, you live a little bit in delusion sometimes, you live in a different world. This is the perception we have, and I'm not the only one saying it. Came out today, a Centre for European Reform, Simon Tilford, said precisely exactly the same things that I'm paraphrasing.
I read his article. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. Do you have the sense that you can have the best of both worlds? Otherwise, everybody would want the best of all.
Well, I mean, I
worlds.
don't have that
No,
sense.
I mean, you live in a country that does. So how do you come to terms with this attitude and actually finding a real win-win agreement, especially on maintaining the single market?
Well, I think that's the real problem. I mean, I would say first of all that I mean, if you look at the result of the referendum, which was actually quite close, not everyone in the UK suffers from that delusion and feels that we can actually have the best of both worlds. And I mean, there are plenty of people like myself who don't see any upside in Brexit at all. And I think the further we get down the process, and the more people start to understand the details about it, and in other words, realise what they've lost, which never came out in the referendum campaign, then I think that the government might well be persuaded to take a rather more pragmatic view. And we wait to see how that's going to move forward. I mean, part of the problem at the moment is that I think a lot of the government's thinking has been dominated very much by, shall we say, a more Eurosceptic and historically Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party. If we had stronger opposition, then we would probably get a slightly broader base for that. It's interesting that the Labour Party is now arguing in favour of essentially preserving them. I think Keir Starmer said that their policy is now to preserve all the benefits of the single market, which is clearly impossible without accepting free movement. So it's actually the Labour Party have said, well, we accept the fact that we'll control free movement, but we want all the benefits of the single market. Well, I don't think that's a practical political position. And if you look at opinion polls in the UK, which politicians have to respond to, I think that's the problem as well. But I mean, I think that's why we need to have a much more pragmatic approach to this whole transitional period. And I think particularly we're going to see that consumers in particular are going to be looking at aspects of that. I think the idea that somehow this would have been a deregulatory movement, as some would have, the British economy has been held back by the shackles of European regulation. I mean, I hear that quite often, and I heard that all the time I was a member of the European Parliament. But now we actually get down to the details of that. I think that the government, I think, will have some flexibility to shift its position. And the other thing I'd just say, finally on that, to open up the discussion, is I think that parliamentarians in the UK are not actually very much attuned to these sort of dealing with all of these detailed issues that they're going to have to deal with. I mean, their parliamentarians are the ones that argue that they wanted to have control. Take back control was probably the most effective slogan of the referendum campaign in the UK. But I think the United Kingdom Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, is completely ill-equipped to take back control because it's never actually been engaged in the detail of what went on in European negotiations, because it was all handled by government and government ministers who didn't really share a lot of the details. So, I mean, I spent 5 years reforming with colleagues here, with the Commission, all the public procurement directives that affect every part of the UK economy. And when the government presented a new public contract regulation to implement that, it spent 3 weeks in the House of Commons before they agreed it.
So if they are ill-equipped, how can businesses, because here we are trying to figure out how businesses can help this process in a way and get prepared for it. How do you think a bank, an engineering company, a service company, how can they prepare and input in the process so that at least their sector is not penalized by this divorce? Well, I think... And all of you, this is a question for all of you. And then
well, I mean, if I can start on that, I mean, I think the Department of Brex EU, David Davis's department, did have a whole lot of meetings to collect opinions from companies, but they haven't had a lot of feedback from that so far. I think it would be fair to say that's certainly the feedback I've been getting. But that's partly because, we were not in the process of actually having to make crucial decisions. I think assuming that we move and the government takes a sensible view to moving towards the trade agreement, and as we're starting to prepare for this repeal, the so-called repeal bills, then I think that's where business has real opportunities to be saying to government, well, this legislation is now going to come into the UK, but it's extremely important for us as businesses that the common standards that we have embedded in this are continued, because they work very effectively, and we want to use those as a basis for free access. So if you're in food manufacturing, you say, well, actually, we think the European Food Standards Agency has done a great job, and it's made our life a lot easier, and we think the UK should continue to operate European food standards and find some way of doing it. And I think some more examples. I mean, Henry's example was absolutely, was a really good one, because the sort of businesses he talks about are the areas where Britain has been particularly good and which has absolutely benefited from being in the European single market. Because the UK has all sorts of businesses. If you look at car manufacturing, I mean, we're very successful in car manufacturing, but about 50 or 60%, I think, of components come from the rest of Europe. I still refuse to use the phrase continental Europe as a matter of, because I don't want it to be entrenched in British psychology. Continent is over there. And people need to understand that we've created lots of new jobs and revived manufacturing centres that were suffering from ageing industries, whether it was declining coal and steel, by exactly taking advantage of being in the single market.
Yeah, so I think there have been some very active advocacy forums that we and other organizations have participated in. So, for example, City UK in the City of London, AFME, which is the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, which is actually based in London, but very rapidly, like the following week after the EU referendum, put a strong foothold in Europe, and it's a very strong industry and advocacy forum. Equally, we have events here we know about, like CEPS, like the CEPS Idea Lab, like the Eurofee conference in Europe. These are places where we have done a lot of advocacy, and other industry participants have as well. So, for example, at the Eurofee meeting in Bratislava, which was a couple months after the referendum, we advocated strongly for transition periods. We weren't the only ones, of course, but that was a strong message, and we've done that through other channels as well. And obviously, we're all talking about transition periods, so it's an important topic for more than just banks. But I think that kind of work really can have an impact, and I think it's important to do it in as organized and positive a way as possible, so that the impacts are really well understood, and we can get the support that we need to keep things stable.
Henrik, but do you actually think you're being listened? I mean, obviously you've been advocating already. Do you feel that the message is being heard, or they are still in a little bit of their cocoon and still looking at
I think the UK government is totally open to receive comments and to understand and trying to understand the implications for their citizens, the companies of Brexit, and trying to anticipate what the consequences might be for many companies of Brexit. So I think, yes, companies are being heard. But that's not really the issue, in a sense, and that's what Malcolm was alluding to. Yes, one thing is being heard, but you don't really know what is being done with that information, and whether, the government, I think, is, acting upon it, or will take that into account in the future discussion. Hopefully it will be. I do think that, what companies should be doing is, first of all, understand the process, keep themselves totally informed of what is going on. I think that is critical, because if you don't understand the process, you cannot influence the process. That's point number one. Number two, companies should evaluate the risks, evaluate the priorities, try to put a value on an occurrence for their business. Number three, they should then prioritize of what is important, what is less important. And then, only then, I think, engage with governments not only in London, but more importantly, and this is something that I realized too late, relatively recently, but in Paris and in Berlin. Because obviously, the governments of the other member states have as a mission to protect the economic interests of their companies as well. And they understand that their companies may be affected by Brexit as well. And so they give their input also to people in the European Commission, people in Brussels and the European Council. So understanding this is very important. And being able then to advocate for a certain position is critical. Whether that advocacy is then ultimately successful is a totally different question. And I think it remains to be seen what will happen in this respect, because I think it's too early. I think the process is not mature enough. But I do, to pick up on your point, Daniel, I'm not sure, and if there's, Malcolm maybe have views, or people in the audience may have views who are closer to this. I'm not sure if the British government is delusional. I think we are faced with a political process, and I would be very surprised that people don't understand what is going on. There's a disconnect between what they're saying and what is going on. But whether in substance they internalize what they're saying is different. Because if you think about it, a lot of it is in words. It's political smoke screening in a way. So the Great Repeal Bill, it sounds like we're going to repeal European Union law, is in reality incorporating European law into UK legislation. When Theresa May talks about a transitional phase, she talks about the implementation phase, which is, again, a different type of terminology to suggest we're not transition, we're starting to implement Brexit, whilst in reality we're putting it off. And then the other thing that strikes me as totally bizarre is the narrative that I hear with certain politicians is that, Brexit is good because it's going to enable the UK to embark on new free trade agreements and lead the way and become freer of the freest of traders. While at the same time, what the UK is doing, it's turning its back really on the most successful, sophisticated free trade experiment in humankind, right? It's basically abolishing national borders as far as commerce is concerned, and it's creating one single border, enabling the members of this customs union to be much stronger in providing market access abroad. And so this continues to be an incredibly successful free trade experiment. And so the narrative that this somehow, leaving the EU is going to be beneficial to, I cannot imagine that serious politicians really believe what they're saying. They might be.
Well, I'm afraid too. And it seems...
One of my many speeches on the European campaign trail, but I didn't manage to get that message across.
No, and it's, I think, 49 or whatever.
Can I just transmit a positive piece of news, which I should have done at the beginning, which is to pass on the best wishes of Vicky Ford, who I know you were expecting to see here, but just to say, for those of you who don't know, the reason why she's not here, which is a positive one from our point of view, is that, as you know, we now have a general election, which was called before this meeting was organised. There are a number of Conservative members of Parliament who are retiring at this election. They were planning to retire in 2.5 years' time. So there are vacancies for a number of safe Conservative seats in the British system, and I'm pleased to say that Vicky Ford has been selected to be the prospective parliamentary candidate for Chelmsford in the United Kingdom, which had a Conservative majority of 18,000 in the last election. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that you will have a former chairman, a very active and energetic pro-European chairman of the Single Market Committee in the UK Parliament shortly, which I think will be helpful for us. But I'm afraid that she means that obviously she will have to stand down from the European Parliament when she's elected to the British Parliament. Anyway, that's a bit of news that some of you may or may not
precisely
have.
what you said is that there was a vacuum of understanding in the national parliaments, and maybe this is filling the vacuum. I would like to open again the floor. I see 3 questions. Maybe, yeah, there is one over there, one here, yeah.
So, my name is Christoph Baert. I work for MasterCard. I'm looking a bit at the end game of all of this. And we often hear about, yeah, we have to go for a win-win situation and we will always be neighbors and all of that rhetoric. If you look at the map of Europe, you see 2 countries that are very prosperous. Switzerland, not part of the EU, never been. And Norway, to a lesser extent, also very prosperous, of course, but also to a lesser extent because they are part of EFTA, and of the European Economic Agreement. If you think about, and for me it's a bit puzzling why okay, and then you hear, okay, yes, there are rich countries because basically Norway has fish and oil, and they are very pragmatic in the sense that they are part of the EU, but they are not part of the decision making. They are just sort of playing without actually being able to influence the rules, and that's fine for them. So that's clearly not where the UK wants to be. Switzerland is a bit of a mystery to me in the sense that, yes, they seem to be able to prosper very well without being part of it. But they've never been part of it, so people sort of say, okay, they're sitting there behind their mountains, and that's fine. Let them be where they are, and everything goes well. Clearly, the UK is not in that situation in the sense that it has been a member of the EU. So therefore, the end game cannot be that actually the UK will do better or should do better after leaving the EU, because then it would send a strong signal that actually, yeah, there is the EU, but actually there is another way to be very successful without actually being part of the EU with all its obligations and rights. So therefore, seen from a European point of view, and it's very sad to say, but I don't want it to be a win-win situation, because it's simply something that it's not like a divorce where the parents are trying to do the best for the children. This is much more fundamental. So in other words, if the UK would do well after Brexit, then it will send the absolute
it opens the Pandora box. You basically
signal that other countries can then also step out, and then the whole thing will then fall apart. So I'm not very optimistic about that.
Okay.
Hello, Sam the Simple Private Company. For the business people, you mentioned that you have scenarios with trigger moments, basically when you decide to relocate businesses perhaps to other places. Can you be a bit more precise in what constitutes a trigger moment for your company?
Ross Melzer from Euractiv. I'd like to pick up on Hendrik's point about organisations communicating the realities of Brexit to the different stakeholders involved in the negotiation, and particularly the tone of the messaging. And it must be difficult to get the tone right, particularly when someone like David Davis, when he has seen various companies and universities, they have been stopped at his door and have been told, don't be negative. I want to hear how you make Brexit work. I just want to, hear some positive messages from you. So if you're trying to give them the real implications and the realities around Brexit, I think that can be a challenge. And I just wonder how, as a company, you deal with that. Thank you.
There are 3 questions. One is alternative models, Switzerland, Norway, and whether if it's working, trying to find a different kind of arrangement, is it going to trigger something wider, something like other countries wanting the same kind of arrangement, a sort of copycat scenario. The second question, the third question was on the narrative, and the second question, the trigger, yeah. You can react to the three of them or just one, whatever triggers your imagination.
Well, what triggers my imagination is trigger periods. I mean, on the first question, this is a personal observation, I just think this is going to take so much time to unfold and for there to be impacts that I think it's kind of hard to envision for me, personally, observing in a very quick period of time the UK or the EU 27 being better off or worse without each other in a way that's real for people. I think we've seen that so far in the predictions that the economy in the UK would really suffer as soon as this happened, and the opposite's happened. So that's not to say it's not going to come, but I personally envision this being readily apparent very quickly. So how quickly that influences other organizations, I'm not so sure. Ultimately, it might, but it might be some years down the road. On the trigger periods, again, it's quite practical for us. For our different businesses, we just work backwards from what we assume at this moment, because we're doing worst case scenario planning, would need to be the ready date. So let's say it's March 2019. If we have some, let's say, technology development that needs to happen in order for us to be prepared to offer the same services to clients in Europe that we offer in the UK. And again, there aren't many. We're pretty solid in Europe right now, but there are a couple of situations where we will likely need to move something. We just work backwards with the technology planning timetable, and that tells us when we need to make a decision about what we're doing, regardless of where the negotiations stand. And those dates are probably not that far out, sometime in, it will vary by business, but they're certainly not 18 months out, let's put it that way. I can't really comment on the dialogue, but I'm sure my panelists can.
So I wanted to, on the triggering event, I'm not sure I agree with you. It's going backwards, but because it is unclear today what the ultimate outcome will be, where we will be for sure on March 31, 2019, and because a transition phase, a longer transition phase, will probably allow businesses to predict with greater certainty where the landing zones are going to be. I certainly, at this stage, am not in a position to say, okay, this is a strong triggering event that we're taking into account as a fixed milestone. You need to let the process work itself out to a certain extent, and then, be flexible in your scenario planning and your contingency planning. On the Switzerland question, I disagree with you to an extent. I think we should try not to fall into the same trap, and by having our views on Brexit being driven by politics or by principles. I think we need to be driven by economic interests on both sides. And so if the UK can be successful outside of the EU, I wish them well. I hope they will be. I think it will create tremendous, if they are, it will create tremendous opportunities for a company like GE with the economic footprint that we have there. They could, for instance, once they can legally engage in trade agreements, they could engage in an ambitious and profound trade agreements with the United States. The benefits for a company like GE would be very important if that were to happen. It would have, to your point, side effects on the European Union side, because obviously modern trade agreements are more about non-tariff barriers than about tariff barriers. And so to the extent there is equivalence between the UK and the US on regulatory aspects or harmonization, that could then have a negative impact on harmonization between the UK and the EU 27. So these are very complex scenarios, but overall, the problem is I don't know what the UK government wants in terms of a trade agreement. I mean, I've heard originally of a bespoke deal. I think the European Council has rejected that. And so I think the Swiss model is off the table, a model whereby there are several specific sectoral agreements. And we've seen this happening in the relationship between the EU and Switzerland, where Switzerland a few years ago voted on a referendum to reduce immigration from the EU, what the UK is thinking about doing now. And we saw the reaction from the EU. The EU played the energy card and restricted, limited the trade in energy and electricity. And so I think the Council has rejected that. So I don't think we'll see a Swiss model. And so perhaps what I think is a more likely scenario at the long term is some type of CETA plus arrangement. But that is going to take a lot of efforts and a lot of time. And then on the narrative, yes, it's tricky, but I think in all of these things and engaging with governments, what really works in my mind is authenticity, is knowing your facts, and giving balanced views, and then engage and advocate to the best of your capability. I don't think there's a particularly more difficult exercise in communicating to the British governments on this issue than other types of sometimes delicate issues that companies could communicate on with government representatives.
Yes, although I want to react just to, although we have seen in terms of narrative that when it comes to TTIP or CETA, that the lack of transparency in the communicating the negotiation has created a very toxic
perceived
or whatever, yes, has created a toxic debate. And it's likely, since these are negotiation and trade negotiation, that we might see a toxic debate as well. This was just from a journalist point of view reacting.
Can I pick you up on the transparency board in a moment, but just coming back to the common interest. I mean, what's striking is if you look at the council guidelines, I mean, the headline is agreement on arrangements for an orderly withdrawal. And there's a very specific paragraph in the council guidelines about issues on businesses trading and operating in the United Kingdom and trading with the Union, and about how we get a transitional arrangement. If you read the British government's white paper, it says almost exactly the same thing in slightly different languages. That we're not required to change everything overnight. We need to provide for a smooth and orderly exit. So I mean, we are already starting from a series of common interests around that, and I think the sooner we try and move the discussions onto the future trading arrangements, the better, and that will obviously require the government to bite the bullet on the financial deal as soon as possible. And there's also some interesting language which I don't ignore because I think they're very important, having worked on the single market for so long. But I mean, this is David Davis's forward about where common frameworks at EU level have also provided common UK frameworks. It will be important to ensure that stability and certainty are not compromised. I mean, I think this is quite a sort of elegant way of presenting it. And that is going to be the basis, I think, for what will be incorporated into the trade agreements. In other words, it will be, if we're going to have the most ambitious and comprehensive trade agreement that the European Union has ever negotiated, then it is going to inevitably take time to do because there are lots of different frameworks to be considered. And in each of those frameworks, maintaining that commonality and how we deal with proposals from the owners of the framework, which will continue by definition to be the European Union, to make changes to it that Britain might not agree with or will have to pass legislation to do that, is going to be one of the issues that we have to face up to, as indeed will the arbitration process, if we have to have some form of arbitration, because the government has made it very clear that we will no longer be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and they're taking that to very serious lengths. So, for example, the UK will leave the Euratom Treaty, even though everybody in the atomic energy industry in the United Kingdom thinks this will be very serious for the UK. But the reason for doing that is because it will continue to be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Now, we have to find some sensible resolution out of this without people losing too much face on it. Now, in all of these areas, I mean, the common framework is clearly something that I think that business can be working with other businesses to design that framework and help the government through the process. Now, then on the question of transparency, I mean, I think that the Council and the Commission have made it quite clear they're going to be very transparent about the way they're going to run this negotiation. In other words, it's not going to be like any previous trade agreement negotiation, and I think many of us involved in that would absolutely welcome that, because I think there's been a lot of mythology around the need for transparency. And I don't think there is that sensitivity in dealing with people who are our former partners. I mean, it might have been true because that's the way the Americans wanted to do it. I think the UK government would have done far better to be much more transparent about what it's talking about now. And I think we're going to have to try and get through this pain barrier and get them to start being much more transparent and being able to discuss all these issues much more freely. And I mean, certainly they're worried about, in some cases, what the press may say, particularly on issues like money. But I mean, the sooner we get out there and get that discussion going, the better.
I want to pick up on one of those points about the framework, because when I try to put in words and communicate that, I would try to have do it in a less jargonic way. And I was wondering if you can help me, because if I take, find a commonality and to create a framework. So in simple words, what are you trying to say? How would you go about it?
I think I gave some examples earlier, but let's take a very specific one, on which I can talk about, because next week I'm sharing a session with the European consumers at a conference in London about food standards and food safety. Now, it's taken a huge amount of effort because these are very sensitive issues, particularly in trading issues between, for example, I mean, one of the stumbling blocks for TTIP were issues about agricultural standards. So, it has been a huge political achievement to set up a European Food Standards Agency whose judgments are now respected by people who, in the entire food supply chain, whether they're producing food, processing food, or marketing food. And that's been a huge achievement. And bearing in mind that I think about 60% of the UK's agricultural production is exported to the rest of the European Union, it's very important for us. Now, in meetings I've had with people in the agricultural food supply chain, they say, well, actually, we'd really like to keep the European food standards as our reference, because we can't really see any benefit in the UK now setting up its own standards agency. So that's the framework. Then the question is, how do we then engage with that framework? And that's going to involve difficult political judgments. Are we going to pay for it? Are we going to cover the cost of it? What happens if there are going to be disputes about those judgments? How are we going to deal with those? How is the UK going to have an input into the process? Would it be able to have an observer on the governing board of EFSA? Where, I mean, until recent times, we've had the chairman of that who has come from the UK. So, but these are the sort of practical and pragmatic issues, which I think I think voters will not instinctively feel that they'd either lost control, or it was an intrusion on British sovereignty, or it was something that they passionately believed we should do, and which will make us distinctively more British if we go for all of those things.
Quite clear. Any reaction on the framework? Not really. Any other questions? I see one. Any other? 2, 3. Okay.
Well, maybe it's not really a question. It's just two remarks. Yes, I'm Cécile May from SES, the satellite company based in Luxembourg. We have most of our customers, and actually in the audiovisual sector, which satellite is very involved into for the transport of signals and television in Europe, most players are based in the UK. The UK is really home country of a lot of different channels, national, international channels. And of course, not being in the single market anymore will create an interesting situation, especially because there are other institutional arrangements and other instruments that exist with the Council of Europe, for instance. So we'll see how it goes. But my remark is, we heard about regulatory flexibility and transitional period. I would say that for our sector, this is really the big problem. As long as we're talking about regulatory flexibility, we actually talk about regulatory holidays, in a sense. When we talk about transitional period, we talk about lack of certainty. So that's really for our sector is the big, difficult part, which is precisely that period which will last years, during which we will completely lack our repère. We won't know anymore exactly what happens. And I think that's really a big concern for us. Now, on the other point is participation of the UK in many different areas, like management of radio spectrum, which is something very important in the sector, is somewhere, we're going to lose something there. We're going to lose the fact that the UK is part of the same geographical area, and we need them to be part of the discussion. So I hardly see that the UK is going to live off the table. They will stay around. And whether there will be simple invitees or there will be a special arrangement, that's an excellent example where we will need to keep them at the table. Thank you.
And that triggers actually the question, is this process reversible? But we don't get into that.
I would say, but I think... But on the basis that UK law will continue, the existing European law will continue to apply with the Great Repeal Bill, then the discussions will then start about what the final arrangements will be.
I'll take the other two.
Yeah, thanks. It's Stuart Newman from the Foreign Trade Association. I just have some concerns about the effect of mainly international, but also European companies that are based in the UK. Because it's my feeling that the reason many of them are there is first and foremost because the UK is part of the EU and has access to this huge market. Secondly, because of the language, because the lingua franca of trade is English. But these days, I think you don't have to be in the UK to find people that speak English to a very high standard. You can go anywhere in Europe and people are speaking English. So I wonder whether it matters so much that, for example, GE engine management is based on the outskirts of Caerphilly or the outskirts of Paris. They could be anywhere, as could many other international companies. And it may take a lot of effort to move their production facilities to one of the other 27 member states. But I see that as a real possibility.
Whether the British ecosystem can be comparable, the British business ecosystem can be comparable. The third question?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Avi Schneibalg. Among other things, I teach negotiation. First, a question and a remark. Question to all the brilliant legal minds here around the table. The people who drafted Article 50, they said, okay, 2 years to have an agreement, and then if you want to extend the 2 year, you need a consensus. Okay, what happens? No agreement and no consensus. What happens? How did a good lawyer draft such an article? Second remark, the single word most used today is the word, after the word Brexit, is the word interest. Okay. I'm sure that all of us here have friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends who all voted against Brexit. I happened by pure chance to talk to some people who were pro-Brexit. And some of them very brilliant people and nice people. And they explained, one of them, I still hear him, I know I'll be worse off for the next 5 and 10 years. It's fine. I accept to pay that price for my identity as a Brit, for Westminster to decide and not these distant, ignorant, stupid people in Strasbourg and in Brussels. And some gentlemen before me talked about win-win negotiation, and we all learned about classical negotiation theory, interest-based. Well, my modest, humble suggestion to Jones Day and other firms, hire one of a few lawyers, of which you don't have, I think, divorce lawyers, and hire people from the neuroeconomics. No, I'm serious. This is in a divorce, lots of decisions are irrational, are against the party's proper economical, rational interests. Let's get into a new field of irrationality, of irrational negotiation. If we don't do that, we're going nowhere. We are in a new way of negotiation, which is not anymore interest-based, it's kind of identity-based. And a lot of irrational elements will take care, and we have to just acknowledge that and to learn how to cope with that. And it's a new challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. Right to the point. I think it's when we're talking about common sense, I think we're coming down to this kind of rational and irrational. So the three of you on the three questions, and maybe you see the time, I don't want to keep you. Yeah, we have another 20 minutes. So who wants to react to those three questions?
Well, I haven't sort of dissected the three questions because they were sort of amalgam of things. But I mean, I think first of all that, I mean, the emotion behind the decision is absolutely clear. And I mean, we have friends as well who, of many years, who voted it to leave, who I failed to persuade. And a lot of it was part of that sort of emotional reaction. That somehow the people have never loved the European Union. It's not seen as being a very cuddly, lovable institution, and the benefits of working together and how we worked and cooperated together have never been very well transmitted. I think there was a point that we discussed a bit earlier, and Alexander De Croo made the same point also, that there are some lessons absolutely for national politicians about how they deal with this, because they've never actually taken the credit for the sort of achievements that we've made within Europe to make the European economy work better, to make life better for consumers, to make an entirely friction-free trading area, to do something which, as Henrik said, is by far the most advanced single trading area in the world, where we actually have instruments, to keep markets open. I mean, a whole lot of other things, but these are very technical matters, and people don't actually see them in their everyday lives. And I would also say that the other thing to reflect on in the UK context is the fact that disruption in the Eurozone, the problems with Greek and the Greek deficit, have really destabilised the image of the European Union among many British voters. And there was a second string alongside that to say, well, we want our national identity back, we want back control, but we think Europe's going to fail anyway. I mean, as one of my Eurosceptic MEP friends said, I mean, why do we want to be handcuffed to a corpse? Because they think that Europe is so unsuccessful, we might as well leave it and do our own thing. So that's another issue, and I think a lesson for European politicians to pick up on. But moving forward, I think, and I want to pick up a point that came up earlier on. I mean, let's not forget that in the global world, we are actually moving with some of these new trade agreements to more mutual recognition of international standards and international legislation. So that in areas like aerospace, for example, I mean, I think we're pretty close to getting, a whole range of international legislation about aircraft safety and operations. In motor vehicles, we're finally moving towards more common standards across different countries. And we were relatively close to achieving that between the United States and Europe. And these are things which are immensely costly and don't help consumers. So, for example, in car crash tests, we had the Americans, because you have these, you throw your car into a pole to test all the side impact. Well, the Americans have a different size of pole, a different speed, and a different position alongside of the car, because apparently American telegraph poles are different from European ones. Well, for the car manufacturers, if they had one set of tests, I mean, it would save them millions of pounds. So I think if there is one positive thing that will come out, or could come out of Brexit, is that we may be starting as part of this common framework process to also saying, well, actually, on food standards, if we're going now to create a common framework between an important customer like the UK and Europe, should we also be reaching out to people or other people outside the European Union? Should we be using that as a basis for reigniting some of our discussions with the Americans on food standards? I mean, that would make a huge market.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have much to add to what you've said. I guess I would observe one thing, which is I was in London the day after the referendum, so June 24th, and we had a very, very early morning before close of Asia meeting on the referendum outcome. So we did it by phone. And I remember my London colleagues shocked that I was on the phone. Now, I happen to be in London. I have both US and UK citizenship. These are colleagues I work closely with. So they were quite shocked to hear me on the phone because they felt it was their UK issue. And they said, what are you doing? What are you doing on the call? And I said, well, I'm interested in this and how we're going to take it forward. And for me, that kind of summarizes a little bit how I've seen this evolve since the 23rd of June. If I think about conferences like Eurofee, which are 6 months apart, it was all very emotional 6-8 months ago. I feel like now it's getting a bit more practical. I think in our industry, we had to pretty quick, we have customers, clients hanging off the end of what we do for them. And so we're not the only industry. I think all of industries have clients hanging off the end of it. But I think we had to pretty quickly start to think about what it could mean for us. And so I've seen the whole discussion move from being very emotional, which I think is understandable, completely understandable. It was a little bit emotional for me, honestly, against the backdrop I just described. But moving towards more practical and I think acceptance that we need to find our way through this and that it won't be easy and that we need things like transitional periods to support smooth and stable execution and implementation of this new environment that we just have to figure out how to live in and work with. And so it's not easy. I don't think, I can't say I feel personally really happy about it, but it's just the pragmatic realities that I think we're trying to work our way through. So I'm not sitting in London, so I'm not close to a lot of the kind of maybe governmental issues, but I can just say how it feels for us here. And there are two sides to this story, which is something I need to often remind my colleagues in the UK and in the US. It's not all about what's going on in the UK. There's a European side to this as well.
Henry.
So I would say that I think we're going to be fine, at least in the short run, hopefully, because of the Great Repeal Bill and this desire to incorporate the acquis communautaire in UK law. And I think the risk of divergence will start once that there is actually a real Brexit implemented, because then the competing interests, the gentleman talked about interest, will start to, will be able to be embodied in different types of regulation, different types of standards, different types of trade protection. So diverging interests will, I think, lead ultimately to different legal and regulatory scenarios. I think the gentleman who spoke about foreign direct investment, you're absolutely right. 60% of US FDI goes to the European Union, 60% of the total US FDI, which is huge. And 25% of that 60% of US FDI goes to the UK. So that's also a very important figure. And the reason is obvious historically for the reasons that you mentioned, and to a certain extent it's also true for GE historically. You know, the UK is the launchpad to accessing single market, and it's a market as such of itself, which is a big market, a successful economy historically speaking, and that has, you know, cultural, for US companies, cultural and language facilities. Having said that, for many companies, including for GE, and I think you were alluding to that, these are the historical reasons. Today, yes, I mentioned at the beginning of my contribution, the UK is a very important country for GE. We have approximately 6 billion euros of sales revenues in the UK. We have 20,000 employees in the UK. We have about 50 manufacturing sites. But in the meantime, we have 100,000 employees in the EU. We have 125 manufacturing sites in the EU. And we achieve approximately 25 billion euros of sales revenues in the EU. And so, I think for many companies who've actually invested in the EU and have built economic footprint beyond the launchpad, I hope that things will be somewhat manageable. And at the end of the day, if there is an increased cost of doing business, if there is disruption, many companies will think of this in relative terms. Yes, relative to my competitors. And if there's costs, but if I'm still more competitive than my competitors, that might be a fine scenario. Who knows? And a lot of companies obviously are thinking in these terms. And lastly, what I wanted to pick up on about this, somebody made the remark about elections in France. And I think one thing that we haven't spoken about, and maybe you alluded also to it, Daniela, is when we think about the title of this conference and the what of the single market post-Brexit, and we all agree that there are opportunities to deepen the single market, to make it work better with the 27. I would be cautious not to make the mistakes that we've made in globalization and trade and forget about the potential victims of a deeper single market. And I think a lot of politicians and society and companies as well have tended to forget about potential downsides to globalization, to trade agreements, and to further European economic integration. And then you're hit with a backlash, similar to, I think, to a certain extent, what's happening with Brexit, and similar to what I think is happening with the US elections. And so, to the extent going forward, yes, we want to make improvements, we want to make it better. I think we should learn from our mistakes and do it in a balanced way and in a way that takes into account of things that we may have missed in the past, and hopefully we'll have great politicians like Mr. De Croo to think about these things.
What you're alluding to, de facto, is the reality that Europe is not just a single market, and maybe further integration on other area, political integration, is the way to go. And maybe Brexit is a sort of shortcut or longer cut, however you want to view it, towards that. I think unless there is a pressing question, we're going to end this debate here. Maybe I'm going to take Barnier's words today when he said, he finished his press conference presenting the recommendation that Malcolm alluded to. He said, there is one thing that Theresa May and myself have in common. It is the love for hiking in high mountains. And and that means that the road ahead is steep, and you have to be careful of the potential, rocks falling on your head. But boy, when you arrive up to that summit, what do you see? And I think, in a way, his metaphor is actually very relevant, because what you see from up there is not the details, but the big picture. So I think I'll finish here, unless one of you maybe wants to add a reaction to that. Maybe no.
Well, I mean, I hope that sort of vision is realised in terms of, to see the two of them standing together and looking at the view. I mean, we'll wait to see. But I think Michel Barnier, who I worked with very closely for 5 years when he was Commissioner for the Internal Market, and we achieved a lot in that time. And he took a very pragmatic view of that. But I think the important thing I think that's come out of the discussion today is that there is a common interest in having this smooth and orderly transition. Even though people like me felt that it was absolutely not necessary to do that, but I mean that's what we should be focusing on. And I mean the more the business can be saying this, I think, to politicians, because I think the smooth and orderly transition part of the negotiations will go much better because they're in a way aligned with the thinking about how European decisions have been made historically. But the big and really difficult political hurdles the Prime Minister is going to have to come up with, the ones that have been put on the table straight away, particularly about how to sort out the financial aspects. And I really do hope that she moves forward on that as quickly as possible. And certainly what I would do is to sort out the basis for the calculations, to agree what we owe and so on, and then to get someone else to go off and sort out the numbers. Let's not just talk about the numbers to begin with, let's talk about the whole basis for getting agreement. And then the sooner we can move on, I think, to talk about the practical details, the better the negotiations will go. And if you can facilitate that in your discussions with the government, I think that will be helpful.
He's probably waiting for that mandate from the elections to do that, right?
Well, I hope so.
On that note of the success and positive note, I'd like to, well, first of all, thank you again for coming and invite you to a reception that is taking place now. So anybody is welcome. And of course, I hope we can all stay here and continue our interesting and passionate discussion over a cup of champagne. Thank you so much again, everyone.